Hey there friends, Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Thank you for being here. This is a missing person segment. And now I'm going to start right off because it's going to be a big one. This, to me, is one of the most important segments I've done in a long time. It involves two cases that I think are joined at the hip. And there were two of the first cases I ever came across in my research. So back in, call it 2009, I started working on these missing people. And I started to get enough information together to write a book. And I wrote Missing 411. I wrote one giant book. It was huge. And I decided I'm going to split it between the eastern U.S. and the western U.S. And in the western U.S., where I split it, there were two cases in there of young boys that disappeared. And at the time, Ben was a little older than these two. Not a lot, though. And the entire time I wrote these two stories, I was thinking about him. I was thinking about him because we took a lot of trips into the woods. Backpacking. Ben wasn't big into backpacking, but he'd go fishing with me and we'd go on hikes and go into the backcountry and we had fun. And as I started to research these two cases of these boys, in the back of my mind, I always had the thought, would I have done anything different if it was Ben? And we talked earlier about the amount of rope you give a young person. You've got to give them the freedom to become an adult. You've got to reiterate to them how much trust you have. And so, at what age do you give them that rope? How much rope do you give them? You don't want to insult them. You want to instill confidence in them. And when I wrote these two stories that you're going to hear, it just hit my soul. So let's start off. The first case involves an 18-year-old young man named Raymond Ewer, missing August 6th, 1969 at noon. Now, he lived in Washington Terrace, Utah, and he was an epileptic. Took medication regularly. Big hint number one. Why is that? Because what I didn't know when I wrote these stories is that how these profile points would start to roll out as I did more and more research. One of those profile points is that people have a condition that's not obvious. You couldn't look at them and tell something was wrong, but they have an unusual condition. Raymond had epilepsy. That's Raymond right there. Now, he went with his dad and two family friends to the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. And early in the morning on August 6th, the group decided to hike into Island Lake to fish. Now, this area of the mountains, there's hundreds of small lakes. Stop for a second. I've said this at least 200 times. If you look at a map of any mountain range and you see that it's got hundreds of small lakes scattered about, flashing yellow lights should be going off in your head because those are the kind of areas that people disappear in. Just saying. Well, this mountain range had a lot of those lakes, hundreds. So they get to the lake and they're going to fish. Sounds just like something I'd do with Ben. What about noon, Raymond got his fishing line severely tangled. And he said he was going to walk back to camp and fix it. He was wearing a light colored shirt, not a heavy shirt, no coat, pants. And he said he'd be back after he fixed the line, and he took off. Now, it was a pretty healthy hike down to the camp, but it was pretty self-explanatory. Well, at 5 p.m. he hadn't returned, so the father and the friends decided to go back to camp and see what happened with Raymond. Well, they get there and they figure out he never arrived. So at 6 p.m. the two friends leave camp to go get a hold of the U.S. Forest Service because they needed help. So where is this? Now, this is important to the story. Again, something I never would have thought about 14, 15 years ago. This is Island Lake. This is the Wyoming border. And 45 miles south of the lake is Skinwalker Ranch. These mountains get up to 11,000, 12,000 feet. I'm telling you, they're just scattered with small lakes all throughout. And this area up in this region of Wyoming, well, why do you bring that up, Dave? Because over in that part of Wyoming, that's where I made Missing 411, the UFO connection. And there was a hunter that disappeared just south of Rock Springs, pretty much near the border. Just saying. Well, U.S. Forest Service arrives on scene, and they immediately start calling for reinforcements. And because they're so close to the Wyoming border, they get a hold of the Wyoming County sheriffs up in that area, and they ask them for assistance. And they get a hold of the sheriffs in Uinta County, and they get their assistance because the Forest Service doesn't have that many people or contacts to the communities that may have extra people, etc. Well, the formal search gets started, and they get Hill Air Force Base to send soldiers that own their own horses into the area because the Evanston County Sheriff, which was coming from Wyoming, said, hey, these guys need horses in this area so they can cover some area. Uinta County said the exact same thing. So they're trying to get people on horseback. Well, what they didn't know was a couple days after their search starts, Raymond was at a place called Hoop Lake. And Hoop Lake, so here is where the dad and his two buddies were fishing. Hoop Lake is 6 miles north, down over some pretty treacherous area. It says 6 air miles. Remember, air miles are never walking miles, so it's probably 12 miles. Searchers hear from a sheep herder that's working right near Hoop Lake. Let me stop you there again. Sheep herders are a pretty common occurrence in Wyoming, Utah, northern Colorado. And they hear from a sheep herder that a young man, Raymond, came up to him a day after he disappeared, August 7th. And he says, hey, can you direct me to my camp? And he kind of tries to explain where he thinks his camp is at. And the sheep herder says, yeah, I can. And it's over in this direction, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, you look like you're kind of ragged. Could I get you some water or some food? And Raymond says, not food, but if you could give me some water, I'd be grateful. And the sheep herder gives him some water, and he last sees Raymond walking away, happy, healthy, and moving in that direction. Now, when I first came out with this story, some people wrote to me and said, well, Dave, it's obvious the sheep herder probably killed him. One problem with that theory is the sheep herder reported when he heard somebody was missing, that he had come to his camp. Raymond came to his camp. So if he had killed Raymond, he's not going to tell anybody he saw him. So no, it wasn't the sheep herder. Well, searchers contacted the sheep herder, interviewed him. He gave this rendition of the story that I just told you. Well, the search and rescue focused on that Hoop Lake area for a couple days, and a place called Cabell Ridge. And that's one of these 11,000 foot ridges, 11,000 foot per the articles, that he had to have crossed over to get to this area. At the same time, the governor of Utah, a man named Calvin Rampton, had heard about this and had heard requests from the county sheriffs that they needed equestrians to respond and assist. And he made a public cry on TV for it. Something that is extremely rare. Now, the rarities keep coming. In my books, I take the articles and I won't rely on one. I've got to have like 4 or 5 on a story to make it viable. In this case, there were dozens. Well, on the 15th of August, Hill Air Force Base sends 20 soldiers, and the U.S. Army sends 30 Special Forces Green Berets. When this story first came out, I said this. 2 Green Berets contacted me, and they said, "Hey, Dave, you need to stop lying. Green Berets don't search for kids." I said, okay. So I sent them the picture in the paper showing the Green Berets on site. And they said, "Oh, wow, we've never heard of this." Let me clarify. There's only a few cases I know about where the Green Berets searched for a missing boy in the mountains. This is one of them. And they stayed on scene for 10 days. And they gave their heart and soul looking for Raymond. Well, on the 18th, they put the search and rescue headquarters on Hoop Lake. And the next day, the formal search for Raymond was over. But the parents, his dad and mom, wouldn't give up. And they knew their son had a lot of determination. Well, the Job Corps sent 35 Job Corpsmen from Utah and 7 supervisors in to search. And then on August 24th, bow hunting opened up in the upper reaches of Utah. And the ongoing theory was hunters don't stay on trails, they get off trails. Well, they already knew that Raymond was not on a trail, because they had covered every trail in the area with hundreds of searchers over the last 2 weeks. So they figured he had to be off trail somewhere, but they didn't know where. Now they had aircraft, canines, they had everything you can imagine looking for this boy. And now bull hunters were coming in, and they thought for sure they're going to find the body now. Well, that always doesn't happen. And a group started called the Friends of Raymond Ewer to keep the search going. And then he was part of a group that even brought more people in. Well, they searched for another week. It got to be about August 31st, and the U.S. Forest Service held a press conference and stated that we're going to presume at this point that Raymond is deceased. And all formal searches with our people, the soldiers, are going to be terminated. Unbelievably, it wasn't over. September 8th and 9th, 50 people went up there and searched again. September 13th and 14th, another 50 people went up there, searched again. Late September 1969, Raymond's parents put this in the local paper. He was never found, and you consider that we're at 50 some odd years later. How can this be possible? How could this boy disappear? And hunters, other fishermen, airplanes, canines, how can they not find him? It goes back to the things I talked about before. Was he even there? Something happened to Raymond after he saw the sheep herder. Point of separation. Key point. Water. Lakes are everywhere up there. Now, while I'm researching that case, another case happens to pop up in essentially the same area that almost blew my socks off. And this is one of the pairs of cases that locked me in that I was onto something. So if I show you this map. So Raymond was fishing at Island Lake. 6 air miles away was Hoop Lake. And about 5 miles away was the Wyoming border. And everything I made a movie about was over in this area. A big part of that movie was in that Cheyenne area. Now, if I show you this, again, Skinwalker Ranch, where Raymond disappeared. Now, if you go 30 miles this way, through these mountains, hundreds of lakes, we come to the next case. August 20th, 2004. 36 years after Raymond disappeared. Same general area. Garrett Bardsley, 12 years old, goes missing. He and his dad are at a place called Uinta Lake in the Uinta Mountains. Now Garrett hiked in with his dad, Kevin, on a Boy Scout camping and fishing excursion. It was in the Wasatch National Forest rather. And Uinta Lake sits at about 10,200 feet. The lake kind of sits in this odd bowl where there's really one way to walk in and one way to walk out. So again, it's almost like if you put fence up here, there'd be no way to get in and out of the lake unless you went through that fence, because the mountains around it are so steep and so high that if you went up the other side, you just skid down the back end, get hurt. So, and inside this bowl, there's a forested area next to the lake. And that's where all the Boy Scouts and Kevin and Garrett are camping. This is Garrett. Well, August 20th, at about 6 a.m., Kevin, smart guy, same thing I would have done. You get up early while the fish are biting, and you got a way better chance of catching them. So he wakes up Garrett. They quickly get something to eat, and they walk 200 yards from their campsite with the other campers to the lake to fish. You with me? This is so reminiscent of my life when I had kids. Kevin's sitting by the lake, and he's rigging Garrett's fishing pole for him. He's putting the string through the eyelets, attaching the hook, putting some weights on. I've done this so many times. I got tears in my eyes doing this when I was researching this story, because it's like I was there. Gives the pole to Garrett, and as he's giving the pole to Garrett, Garrett slips and he falls in the lake. Well, it's cold. Even though it's August, that early in the morning, it's cold. And they both fish for a short period of time. And Garrett, they're not catching anything. So Garrett says, hey, I'm getting a little cold. I'm going to go back and I'm going to change my socks. Kevin says, okay. So as Garrett's walking away, Kevin turns around to make sure he's going back to the right place. And he sees Garrett walking into the forest that surrounds the camp. Between the lake and the forest, there's some area you can watch him walk, and then he disappears into this forested area. And remember, it's the ridge of that lake around the outside, so you can't go too far. Well, he sees Kevin go right back to the camp. Doesn't think anything of it, goes back to fishing. After 15 or 20 minutes, Kevin realizes Garrett should be back. And just like any good father, he put his pole down and he went back to camp to see what was taking so long. Well, he comes into camp and he knows everyone's still asleep. Looks around, doesn't see anybody. Gets bothered, walks back toward the lake, doesn't see anything. Friends, there's no place to go. And now he gets really nervous. So he starts waking up other Boy Scout troop leaders and he says, hey, I lost my son. I don't know where he is. He's not in that lake. He's in this camp or he's somewhere. We got to find him. So they search. They search that whole basin area. Nothing. Well, at about noon, one of the other leaders hiked out and contacted the Summit County Sheriff. It was about a 1-hour hike from their camp to the parking lot. Where they come in and they start searching. And they first comb that area inside the lake basin thoroughly. Then they start combing the outside. And just a half mile from where Garrett was last seen, they found something that just shook my soul. In the middle of a huge boulder area, on the side of a ridge, they see a sock. They go up there and get it, and it's a Nike sock, which was 100% positively ID'd by Garrett's mom as his sock. Okay, let's hold on. If you've been with me for a while, I've stated that boulder fields are a big part of disappearances. To me, that boulder field was a 10x on what happened to Garrett. So now, do I think he somehow made it out of that basin and walked up into that boulder field and slipped into one of the rocks? No. Because Garrett wasn't going to go anywhere but back to camp, change his socks, which were never changed, and then come back and meet his dad for fishing. Something happened in the tree line. Something was watching Kevin and Garrett. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. Point of separation, proximity to water. Now boulder field. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't there to help, but they continued to search. They searched the boulder field thoroughly, supposedly. And then they kept moving out. They had canines there, they had air support. They had everything you can imagine that you would need to find a 12-year-old boy. But again, when you are trying to apply logic to something that is illogical, it doesn't make sense. Now, people have asked me over the years, would Garrett have gone up that boulder field voluntarily? Nope. He was with his dad. He told his dad he'd be right back. Garrett was a good kid. The boulder field was a half mile from that forested area. The forested area was the only place inside that entire lake area that had good cover. The only place. And remember, the dad saw him walk into that area. Just 50, 100 feet more would have been his campsite. So let's think about this. Raymond Ewer, 18 years old. Garrett Bardsley, 12 years old. Both boys were fishing. Both boys were in the Uinta Mountains, in close proximity to Wyoming. Now, Raymond was last seen at Hoop Lake. Garrett was last seen at Kuberant Lake, 35 air miles. This is the way you'd have to drive to get to each. Now, back in the day, there was no drive per se to get to either one. You had to hike in. Things have changed. Both boys were with their fathers. Both disappearances occurred in August, 36 years apart. I've always said this, I'll keep saying it. You separate these cases by 20, 30 years. People die, people forget. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But if you look at both cases independently, you could see the similarities here. Now, I don't think anything happened to Raymond until he left the sheep herder. Something happened then. Garrett's was more timely. I think something was watching Kevin and Garrett and waited for that point of separation. But what? I'm sure some of you who know me know what I'm thinking. But I want you to use your own mind on this. Neither boy was ever found. Unbelievable. Now, just by mere endurance, Garrett couldn't travel as far as Raymond. Raymond was older, more mature, had more endurance. Garrett, younger, not as enduring, should have been found. 100% should have been found. Boulder fields scare me. I'll tell you a quick story. I have a very good friend who lived in Colorado when I was there. He had read one of my books. He said, "Dave, want to know something weird?" I go, "What's that?" "I've never told you this." But his wife's there with him. He said, "My wife and I were way up in the mountains of Colorado, like at 12,000, 13,000 feet. We were hiking. And Dave, we were below a boulder field. And all of a sudden, small pebbles were getting thrown at us from up in the boulder field." He says, it was annoying, but then again it was confusing because we looked up there and we didn't see anything except huge boulders the size of cars. And he says, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, I'm glad you got out of there and I'm glad you weren't hiking alone. But how many times has this happened to people that they're afraid to even say anything about it? What is going on?" Well, that's the million-dollar question. And until people are willing to open up and talk about these things, it's going to stay muddled. But these two stories, they hit me hard when I wrote them. Just telling you today, they hit me hard. Because Raymond's father's name was Raymond. Garrett's father, Kevin, went on and started a foundation to help other missing people. I think he had to do it to get that feeling off his chest that he lost Garrett. Good people, great people, losing their sons. Friends, I appreciate you being here. These are two super important cases. If there's ever a time to put these on your social media sites and spread them around, I wish you would. I wish we could build off of this, because I think everybody could relate to it. I appreciate you being here. Paulides out.